Welcome to the deep dive. We've got some really quite concerning information today, focusing on Nancy Menser and her brother Randall, who was a U.S. military veteran.
Yes, and it sounds like Nancy, as his only living relative, has really been through an ordeal trying to understand what happened with his care,
Yeah,
specifically at the Marion, Illinois VA facility.
exactly. And today, we want to try and unpack two main things based on what we've seen. The situation around Randall's care, obviously, but maybe even more importantly, this issue of his power of attorney, Nancy's POA, and the claim it was verbally revoked.
Right. That POA issue seems central legally. We're looking at Nancy's own communications, some news articles, investigation details. It paints a pretty troubling picture.
It really does. And Nancy's starting point, her core belief, is that the Marion VA was responsible for her brother's death. This goes back to 2017.
Which is, I mean, that's an incredibly serious accusation. It really sets the stage for everything else she alleges happened.
Absolutely. Her claims are very direct. She actually uses the word murdered in relation to her brother and the Marion VA. She also points to the director there being moved to Kentucky afterwards.
Mm.
And then there's this really stark allegation about the head of the OIG, the Office of Inspector General, the internal watchdog for the VA.
Right, the body meant to investigate problems.
Yes. She suggests they were involved in a cover-up. She even mentioned, I think, an email from a nurse talking about keeping suspicious deaths out of the news.
That's explosive. If true, it undermines the entire purpose of the OIG and the number she mentioned.
Yeah, she claimed Randall was the 16th suspicious death at the community living center there. 16. It's hard to even process that number.
16 deaths labeled suspicious in one specific VA center, the community living center, which is typically for long-term care. That demands serious investigation. Any hint of an OIG cover-up on top of that is, frankly, deeply alarming.
And Nancy didn't just sit back. She wrote letters, emails, trying to get someone, anyone, to listen.
Well,
Senate committees, House committees, Senators McConnell and Rand Paul, the VA OIG itself, even the president.
You can just feel the desperation and frustration there, can't you? Trying every possible avenue when you feel the system itself is failing you, or worse, covering something up. It shows how hard it can be for one person against a huge bureaucracy.
Okay, so let's pivot to that core legal point, the power of attorney. Nancy says hers was verbally revoked, just told it was revoked. And right after that, a VA doctor was apparently appointed as Randall's surrogate decision maker.
Okay.
And Nancy's belief, her stated reason for why this happened, was specifically to stop treatment from a choice cancer doctor she had found for him.
Right. This is, legally speaking, probably the most critical piece here. A power of attorney, especially for healthcare, it's a formal document. It grants specific legal authority.
So can you just verbally revoke something like that, a medical POA or
Yeah.
even financial, that actually, legal?
Well, generally speaking, no. In almost every jurisdiction, you can't just verbally undo a formal written power of attorney. Think about it, the whole reason you put it in writing, often with witnesses or notarization, is to make it clear, official, and verifiable.
Right, to avoid confusion or arguments later.
Exactly. Allowing someone to just say, oh, that POA, it's canceled, especially if the person who granted it, the principal, might be ill or vulnerable. Well, it opens up a huge potential for misunderstanding, disputes, even abuse.
So what is the proper way then, if someone wants to revoke a POA?
Typically, the person who granted the POA, the principal, needs to execute a formal written revocation. They sign it, date it, often needs witnesses or a notary, just like the original document sometimes. And crucially, that written revocation needs to be communicated,
Communicated how?
delivered formally to the agent, that's the person who had the power, so Nancy in this case, and also to anyone relying on that POA, like the doctors, the hospital, banks maybe. Everyone needs to be officially put on notice that the agent's authority is gone.
Okay, that makes sense. So if Nancy's account is accurate, and it was only a verbal revocation,
Then legally, it's highly unlikely it was valid.
which means the appointment of a VA doctor as a surrogate decision maker right after that, that becomes really questionable, legally speaking.
Extremely questionable. If her POA wasn't legally revoked through the proper written procedure, then Nancy likely still held the legal authority to make those medical decisions for Randall.
Based on the document he signed.
Correct. And if the VA then ignored that valid POA and appointed their own decision maker, especially, as Nancy alleges, to override her chosen treatment plan, well, that looks like a potential overstep of their authority and an infringement on Randall's documented wishes and Nancy's legal rights as his agent.
Could she have challenged that legally at the time?
Potentially, yes. If her POA was valid and ignored, that could certainly be grounds for a legal challenge against the decisions made by the VA-appointed surrogate. It hinges entirely on whether that revocation followed the proper legal steps, which a verbal statement almost certainly does not.
Now, let's bring in this other name Nancy mentions, Joanne Ginsberg. She identifies her as the director at the Marion VA when all this was happening with her brother.
The person in charge at the facility.
And Nancy claims the people involved in her brother's death, as she puts it, were either moved to other VA places or are, like, working from home now. She sees it as avoiding accountability.
And based on some of the background information, Joanne Ginsberg's career path within the VA does show a pattern of transfers. There were reported issues before Marion, things like appointment wait times in Wyoming, some kind of scandal alleged in Portland.
Right, saw notes on that. Then she comes to Marion, and this is where we see the radiology reporting issues come up, the alleged bonus scam, and crucially, Nancy's claims about the 16 deaths in the community living center during her tenure.
Yes, the timing aligns. And after Marion, she was transferred again, this time to Louisville, where other concerns reportedly surfaced, like issues around how PTSD patients were being labeled or diagnosed.
So you see this pattern. Alleged problems surface, and the person moves to another facility. Nancy explicitly connects Ginsberg's time as director in Marion to those 16 deaths. It really raises questions about leadership and oversight, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Seeing an individual move between facilities following serious allegations, without, it seems, clear public accountability or resolution at each step, it's troubling. It points towards potential systemic weaknesses in how the VA manages performance, addresses problems, and ensures patient safety consistently across different locations.
Okay, so just to bring our focus back before we wrap up,
Yeah.
we've looked closely at Nancy Minzer's experience, her devastating claims about her brother Randall's death at the Marion VA, and particularly this critical issue of her power of attorney allegedly being revoked verbally.
And based on standard legal practice, that verbal revocation seems highly unlikely to be legally sound, which makes the subsequent appointment of a VA doctor as surrogate very problematic.
Right. And we've also touched on the documented career path of Joanne Ginsberg, the director at Marion during that time, and the series of issues and transfers associated with her tenure at multiple VA centers, including the period linked to the deaths Nancy alleges.
It highlights how failures in following established legal procedures, like those for POA revocation, can have profound, potentially tragic consequences, especially when critical healthcare decisions are being made for vulnerable patients. Nancy's fight really underscores that.
So it leaves us, and you, the listener, with a pretty stark question, I think. We have legal documents like powers of attorney, specifically designed to protect an individual's wishes for their care. What does it signify about a system if those documents could potentially be sidelined by something as flimsy as an alleged verbal revocation? And perhaps more importantly, what real recourse do people like Nancy, his only relative, actually have when they believe these fundamental legal rights, this autonomy, have been ignored within a large institution, possibly affecting the life or death care of a loved one? It forces us to consider that balance between institutional power and the individual's legally protected choices in healthcare.